Is this true that this sort of organized dinner meeting was at Facebook's request?
They did request. I've known Zuckerberg for some time. I wanted Mr. Zuckerberg, though, to hear directly from other senators the seriousness of their concerns. I mean, I've been sparring with Facebook on a host of issues over the last couple of years. I wanted him to hear that this does not come from a single group of senators, that it is broadly based, it is bipartisan. The wild, wild west days of social media have to come to an end. And we went through a series of areas where I think we're going to need some level of regulation or legislation.
Yeah, we've touched base with you several times as various CEOs have come to hearings. What's new about this one?
Well, I think there may be perhaps a little more humility coming from Facebook. Remember, it was about a year ago that Mr. Zuckerberg appeared in testimony, and there's been quite a few whacks on Facebook and on Google and others over that last year. They've also received the largest fine in FTC history, I think $5 billion. But so Mr. Zuckerberg has said that he's willing to work with us on legislation. The challenge to a degree has been, can we get some of this legislation to the floor? I think we are way behind already, behind Europe and behind states like California on privacy legislation. I also think we need legislation that would ensure that as users, we have a right to know when we're being communicated with by a human being versus a bot. I think we need to make sure that we have the ability to know what data is being collected about us, how much it's worth. And if we're tired of Facebook, we should be easily able to move our data from Facebook to a new platform, but still be interoperable with those friends who remain on Facebook. So there's areas that would drive more competition. There are areas where the United States could reassert kind of technology leadership, which unfortunately in social media we've ceded to the Europeans and to states. And my hope is, and over the coming weeks, we'll see whether these kind of meetings actually translate into the legislative proposal that I and others have. Whether Facebook will go ahead and say, yes, we affirmatively support these efforts.
Yeah, Senator Warner, Senator Blumenthal used the word impressed about last night's meeting. Is that the same word you'd use?
I would say that Mark Zuckerberg is a very smart, thoughtful guy. But there has to be acknowledgement that kind of self-regulation, or that all the wisdom in the world resides in Silicon Valley, is not cutting it with the American public. And the good news is that, for example, every bill I've outlined, I've got a Republican co-sponsor. So this is not a partisan issue. This is really a future past issue. Those of us who want America to remain a technology leader know we've got to put some rules of the road into place. And I just hope that not only do we see this from Facebook, but we need the same kind of collaboration from Google, from Twitter, and a series of these secondary platforms where increasingly, for example, a lot of the hate speech is moved.
Senator, you just mentioned privacy, transparency, data collection, data portability, issues of competition. What can the Senate realistically get done, especially as we approach an election year?
Well, that's where the burden, I can't really blame that on the companies. I got to blame it on us. I mean, throughout our history, America, at least post-Sputnik, has always been the technology leader, and we've set the rules of the road, and the rest of the world has followed. So I think it is really incumbent upon me and my colleagues, to kind of put together these coalitions, and they are bipartisan, and convince the majority leader, let us have a chance to bring this legislation to the floor. Frankly, I think most of these bills would get 70 to 80 votes, and that doesn't even touch an area, for example, around election security. We also spent time there. How do we make sure that we have the appropriate disclosures on political ads? The same on Facebook and Google as if you advertise on CNBC. This is not rocket science. And Lord knows we shouldn't make the protection of our democracy, a partisan issue. Wouldn't make protection of the financial system a partisan issue. So, we've got to put the pressure on the leadership here to let us have a chance to bring these bills to the floor.
So is that issue one? If you were to rank them, what's the top one of all those issues that you would bring to the floor first?
I think with the election less than 18 months away, election security, privacy, and then the host of these transparency, pro-competition issues. I don't, what I would hate to have happen is for us to say, okay, let's take some small ball, get it done, and say we've dealt with this issue. This is going to require a comprehensive approach. And frankly, the companies, I think, are getting the fact that the longer the federal government delays, because the government will act, the longer we delay, all they're doing is the bar is being raised as other European countries or individual states and other nations around the world, put regulatory regimes in place. And they're simply raising the ceiling to a new floor.
Senator, whether it's Congress, state AGs, FTC, DOJ, I mean, how do you explain to investors who's truly driving oversight? And how do you convince them that there's no Keystone Cops kind of overlap?
Well, I would argue that we actually got the opposite right now. Companies of this size that have this much power on our daily life, in our political life, on our economic life, the fact that there is no regulatory entity, that's pretty remarkable. Obviously, the FTC technically, but the FTC has been fairly toothless and have not stepped up and taken on this responsibility. And if we don't want this quilt work of different rules in every country and different rules in every state, then it's incumbent upon Congress to act. If we want to give that kind of assurance to the investor community, once we set the rules of the road, I think it will give predictability, and that's why I would hope that the companies, and I think they're getting this, would kind of lean in and say, and bring their own set of pressure to bear to say, hey, let's negotiate and then let's get this legislation to the floor.
You think you use the word toothless because it's just about writing a check? I mean, FTC's made quite a big deal about these record fines.
When you're talking $5 billion, sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, but it's not when it's a fraction of the revenues made on a quarterly basis by Facebook. Again, these companies, and I celebrate their success. I'm not, dismissing that success. But if you can take the kind of, and the $5 billion fine was around the Cambridge Analytica issue where people's data was misused and users were not informed. But if you can somehow build into your business model that, once a year you got to pay a $5 billion fine, but you're not going to change your business practices, that is not a good solution for consumers, for investors. And I'm not suggesting that that's what Facebook is proposing, but we've got to make sure that with penalties come real teeth. And unfortunately, with enterprises this large, $5 billion, it is still just a slap on the wrist.
Senator, recent remarks from you at the PEN America Symposium, quote, Western companies who help authoritarian regimes build censored apps or walled garden versions of the internet are just as big a threat to a free and open internet as government actors. Were there specific companies you had in mind when you made that comment?
Well, one of the companies was Google, who was willing to work, I believe, with Tencent in China, or if not Tencent, it was maybe it was Baidu, but to work where the Communist Party in China is trying to use their tech companies to create a social credit system that monitors the citizens of China, a surveillance state that would make Orwell's 1984 look like children's play. And some of these companies who I think their founders, sometimes will make these grandiose statements about the good they want to do. Well, that rhetoric needs to match reality, particularly when you partner with China that is trying to use technology to create a surveillance state, and frankly, taking that surveillance state and trying to export it now to other countries around the world. So I do think they need to be held accountable.
Senator, just to shift gears here, on a day when Huawei is unveiling its new 5G flagship phone without Google licensed apps, and you have officials from the U.S. and China rekindling trade talks, what do you think that relationship long-term should look like between Huawei and both the U.S. government and U.S. tech companies?
Well, let's step back for a second. We were I think we, the government, and for that matter, American tech companies were caught off guard with the ascent of Huawei. So here you have a company that puts out some pretty good product that's totally subsidized by the Chinese government, which allows them to put product into the market at at a much discounted price. And yet you've got this company that at the end of the day is not responsible to shareholders, but responsible to the Communist Party. And you can simply look at the Chinese law that validates that. So the idea that we could just allow a market-based solution and the best company win isn't going to play out in 5G. And if we think about all the Internet of Things connected devices that will ride on a 5G network, we've got to have security. And Huawei, because it's a distributed network, the software upgrades, you can never guard against the ability of the Chinese government to put that malware at a future time downstream. And so we have to convince our allies not to go with Huawei, which is much cheaper, but at the same time, we don't have a horse in this race. There are great companies, Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, none of them American companies. And I think what we're going to have to do is frankly, and a lot of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle agree with me on this, is the American government may need to invest or in collaboration with our allies, try to make sure that there is an American or at least Western alternative to Huawei that we can match in both quality and in price, and to make sure, as the Australians have already done, that, you know, we need to say to other countries, do you really want to do business with a company that's going to have your whole telecommunications network where in that home country there is no independent rule of law or independent judiciary? I think any reasonable country, any country that are allies that welcome an open democracy ought to think twice. But so far, even if we put the notice out, we've not been able to say, here's what we would propose as an alternative solution.